Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the Fighter Pilot's Guide to Living. This is our second time following the career of retired Rear Admiral Frederick "Bad Fred" Lewis. And in the first episode, if you missed it, that captured from the beginning of Bad Fred's career at the U.S. Naval Academy up through his first deployment to Vietnam on the USS Forrestal in 1967, which ended, unfortunately, in tragedy. Today, we're picking up with his second Vietnam deployment in 1968. And in terms of chronology, this episode ends with when Bad Fred screened for command and became the XO of VF-142. And the end of the episode is really dedicated to when Bad Fred first met Dale Snodgrass, who at the time was the squadron LSO for VF-142. Most of you know Dale better as Snort, who is one of the most beloved Tomcat pilots that I have ever heard of in my time listening to aviators tell stories. So Bad Fred talks about his relationship with Snort, which is really special. And then we kind of talk about the fighter pilot culture, what the O Club means to fighter pilots, why it's important throughout history, and what happens at the O Club. Obviously not all of it, because that's not for civilian conversation. For those of you who missed the beginning of last episode, I suggest you go back and just listen to Bad Fred's incredible career. He's been at the apex of so many developments in U.S. naval history, but he also wanted me to add something to the list of accomplishments that he has achieved, and that's that while he was at the Naval Academy, he earned first team All-American honors on the lacrosse national championship team. I'm not surprised at all. Bad Fred is good at everything, I think, and just such a stellar human. So without further ado, I'm going to let Bad Fred tell his own story.
So about 6 of us, I think overall in the air, of all the air wing pilots, requested transfers. I requested a transfer immediately. So after we got back, about a few weeks after I got back, I got my oldest to a VF-33, another squadron, deploying the next spring back to Vietnam, which is what I wanted. And so we started looking up at VF-33. So as far as the morale on the ship, of course, the morale, people were very, upset about what had happened, rightfully so. And we managed to truck back across, and we back to the U.S. after the fire, and people did their thing and got on with their lives.
During that next workup, did you take into consideration all those things that you said you weren't trained on properly for that first deployment, looking out for SAM and AAA and all those things? I mean, was that part of VF-33's workup process?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was the weapons training officer, and I had a lot to do with the training program for the squadron. I made sure that we did the kinds of things that we needed to do, including deployments to Yuma and weapons deployments, and getting everybody well versed in all the weapons we carried, the tactics that we had to use, and the restrictions that we had to fly under when we went back again. So I deployed on April of 1967 on Forrestal, and then I deployed in April 1968 on USS America in VF-33.
And how long was that deployment when you got to the Gulf of Tonkin, and what was the air war like this time around for you?
Oh, the air wing was really a fantastic air wing. Great squadrons, great people, good pilots, good air crew, great ship. It's a newer ship than the Forrestal was. We had a lot of fresh water. We take a shower. Then never had to go on water hours. So that's great. But no, it was we were, I think I applied the best I could the lessons learned that I'd experienced in preparation for the deployment on the American. So I was able to do that and try to help get all the aircrew pilots in Rios, get them prepared for combat. And we did that. So that deployment ended on the early November 1968, and so when we detached and 6 feet and headed home again. Only this trip was a little bit different. It was not back through the Straits of Malacca or across the Indian Ocean around Africa. It was to go the other way to conclude an around the world deployment. So it was underway out of Subic Bay down to Sydney, Australia for R&R, across the ocean there to New Zealand for a couple of days in New Zealand, and then back around South America, Cape Horn, up to Rio de Janeiro and back home. So circumnavigation of the world in America.
And that was kind of if my memory serves, that was also that Sydney deployment, or the Sydney stop is where another large event in your life took place. Is that,
Oh,
do I have
huge,
my years correct? All right, let's
huge.
talk about that, because I loved this story when you shared it with me.
This,
I wanted to capture it for sure.
this makes the softer side a little happier than the harder side of what I was just talking about, the forest fire. But yeah, I was just so lucky. A lot of the guys, after the deployment was concluded in early November, a lot of guys flew home on what was called the magic carpet, and so they got so what was left on the ship was a skeleton crew for the air wing, and I was a bachelor, so most of the guys who flew home on the magic carpet were married guys, families and so forth. They got home. I said, no, we're going to Sydney. I'm staying right here. I don't want to go home too early. So I sailed on the ship. We made our port visit into Sydney. We're there for 4 days, and each en route from the PI down to Sydney. It took about a week, I think, to get down, as I recall. But every day we get messages from the U.S. Embassy about a big cocktail party. The first night we were going to be in Sydney, and the statement would read, every day changed. We went up in numbers, but we have 200 young ladies invited to the event. And the next day, we said we have invited 400 young ladies to the event. And then it got up to 800 young ladies were invited to the cocktail party. So, and there was only a skeleton crew of officers on the air wing on the ship, and then of course the ship's company officers as well. Well, we arrived in Sydney that day, and that evening was a cocktail party. We went ashore, and there couldn't be any more than maybe 200 officers, maybe less than that. We arrived at this big, beautiful hotel in downtown Sydney, and there was a huge party going on, and there were a lot of very, very nice people there. And I walked in and looked around, and I saw this one girl, and I said, I have to meet her, and that's when I married.
And you guys, it was, how many days were you there? And you
We
told
were
her
there
you were
for
going to come
days.
back?
Yes, yes. We were there for 4 days, and I met her that night, and I proposed that night.
That's
Mhm.
incredible. And the
And,
beautiful thing is it worked out. And tell me about, because you tried to keep in contact with her on the boat, right? How did that work out?
I said I met her the first night. We were there for 4 nights. She had a date with somebody else on one of those 4 nights, and she'd already committed to it. So I saw her 3 of the 4 nights. And the last night I saw her before we got on the way to come head east and go around with New Zealand. Anyway, so I told her I was going to come back, and so en route from Australia to New Zealand and then home again across the vast reaches of the Pacific Ocean, I was writing letters every day. But each letter, all the letters went down to the ship's post office. They weren't leaving the ship anywhere. But I wrote a letter to her every day. So we finally get to Rio de Janeiro, and all that stuff, mail and things, all got moved off the ship. So they got into the system. That was when we got underway about in early December, and it was about Christmas time that she got just a week before Christmas, I guess it was. She got a shoebox full of letters from me, and she said, "Well, maybe the yank is serious." So, I had accepted orders at Test Pilot School, and I had 30 days leave. I detached from my squadron here at Oceana in January of '69, and started hitchhiking around the world. I hitchhiked on MAC flights from the East Coast to Honolulu down to Sydney, Australia, and we re-engaged at that point and reaffirmed our intent to get married, and then I met her parents, and their first inclination was to shoo off the yanking, to really yank. You know, I was determined, and so we were there in Sydney and again the night before, and lovely people. I just love them, and we had a lot in common with her dad. He was a bomber pilot in World War II for the Royal Air Force, great hero of the Royal Australian Air Force. And so I had to ask him for his permission to marry his daughter, of course. So we went on a pub crawl around Sydney, going from pub to pub to pub, drinking a lot of beer. And finally, I had enough beer to have courage to pop the question. And when I did, he didn't respond right away. He said, "Oh, maybe I overreached the mark here." And he paused and they looked at me and they said, "Fred, and he was a bomber pilot, I remember." So he said, "Fred, the only objection I have you to marry my daughter is that you're a fighter pilot." So then we had 10 days later, we had a big, huge wedding in Canberra, Australia, the capital of the country, the Dungeon Military Academy, which is the military academy for all the services in Australia. In the chapel there, and by an Episcopal chaplain on the Australian Army. 200 people at the wedding, and anyways, it's a lot more to the story, but we wound up pretty happy. We're still married. 55 years, 56 years, 56 years.
That's really amazing, especially, just the amount of movement that you've done in your career, the number of positions that you've taken, the shortness of that engagement, all those things, you've prevailed through all of it. That's a fairy tale story right there. And I
Yeah.
think it's really incredible. Um,
My wife and I have dined out on that story many times in our lives.
Oh, I would love telling that. But the ability to go tell that story would be so fantastic, and I'm glad you get to. That's really special. And we kind of you mentioned this, and I'd like to talk about this aspect too. At this time, you were told you could either go to U.S. Naval Test Pilot School or that you could become a Blue Angel. Those were the two opportunities presented to you simultaneously
Yeah,
during your Vietnam deployment, correct?
correct.
And tell me about what that felt like and how you made that choice.
Well, I was really happy, of course, that I'd been selected by somebody, and I had I kind of had an idea what my future might be. And it was in the middle of the combat deployment too, when in fact, when we got the word. And as I mentioned, my commanding officer was a test pilot school graduate, and he influenced me strongly as far as career purposes are concerned. Going to TPS would be a lot more enhancing for your career than going to Blue Angels. Well, the Blue Angels would be a heck of a lot of fun. So much fun. And so I thought about it long and hard, and then there's no question about it. His words swayed me in the direction of going to TPS, and that's when I selected this school. And then later on, when I was in the midst of test pilot school, working hard and a student there at TPS, I said, what am I doing here? I should be a Blue Angel. But had I gone the other route, I would, as I said before, other things, the whole life path will change significantly.
Absolutely. And as I said before, everything happens for a reason, and I think you mentioned too when we were talking about this right before we started recording, the Blue Angels had a lot of accidents, correct, in that
Yeah.
period. Can you tell me about what you saw of that and if it made you feel like you had perhaps made the right decision?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact number, but it seemed to me that the Phantom was a good airplane that made a lot of noise, but it wasn't really it was not a good turning airplane. Um, and it was not the flight control system in the airplane did not, did not really enhance your feel for the airplane. Whereas in the F-11 and then the subsequently flew the A4, now the F-18 are just better handling airplanes than the Phantom was. The Phantom was an airplane you had a horse around. It was a manly airplane, we call it. It was not a very forgiving airplane, uh, like some were. So, that none of that, of course, influenced my decision to go one way or the other. Uh, I felt I could fly anything. Most, every pilot does. Every fighter pilot does anyway. So if it's got a stick in the throttle, I can fly it. So stick aft, and the houses get smaller, pull it forward, the houses get bigger. So, that didn't influence me at all in terms of my decision.
What was Naval Test Pilot School like? Were you, tell me about that period. And I think if my mental calculations are correct, that was when you were newlywed, correct? That you started
That's,
Naval Test Pilot School. So tell me about how those things all came together in your life at the same time.
oh wow, that's a long, long story. I won't give you any. So listeners and viewers, be at ease. I'm not going to go down a rabbit hole here for you, but anyway, it was uh, it was a tough transition to make. I'm being a combat aviator and then in an academic environment, and you had to relearn things you'd learned in school and college and at the Naval Academy. The math was important, of course, your math background, your ability to write, explain things to you, describe things in reports and so forth. And academically, it was a challenge for not for everybody, but for most everybody. And you're thrown from an operational environment into immediately an academic, a very difficult academic environment. It was a bit of a challenge. But on the other hand, it was also a lot of fun. Really had fun. I had wonderful people who were in my class at the Test Pilot School, and wonderful instructors. The ground school people and one civilian in particular, a guy named Mr. Tom Moore. Tom Moore was a legend in his own time. He was a fantastic person. So we were lucky in that regard. But we had a whole stable of airplanes that we could fly. Back in at that period of time, if you wanted to fly a different airplane, this is after Test Pilot School. The Test Pilot School gave us this sort of confidence. If you want to fly an airplane you never flew before, you find somebody who could check you out on a particular machine. You take a quick 10-question open book test and learn some of the emergency procedures, and then they go for one flight, and then they give you the keys to the airplane. So, there's no limit in terms of the numbers of different airplanes you can fly. So, from the pilot's standpoint, it was a great, wonderful place to be. And the missions that we were flying were important missions that we were flying in the test community. And this was just a lot of fun, a lot of camaraderie there. People were focusing on the job and getting the mission accomplished and doing the job that test pilots did. So overall, it was a great experience, and slowly over time, my disappointment of not being a Blue Angel kind of eased off, and I was happy being a test pilot.
Tell me how, I feel I should know the answer to this question, but I don't because I was not in this environment. But does Naval Test Pilot School kind of equate to like Top Gun, what that would become? Or tell me about, I guess, the actual mission. If you're flying lots of different kinds of jets, are you trying to learn how they can, how you can dogfight this versus this, or what was the prime objective of going to that school?
The prime objective is to train pilots how to evaluate airplanes and determine their suitability for the mission that they're supposed to be designed for. That's a fundamental reason for doing testing. There's all kinds of tests. Flying qualities tests, how does it handle performance tests? Does it go as fast as it's supposed to go, or does it go as slow as it's supposed to go into landing speed? And can it withstand carrier environment catapults and so forth? All those features, those pieces that make up the ability of the airplane to perform the aviation mission at sea are the things that are looked at the test center. So the test pilot school was to prepare you to go into the test center and be that kind of a pilot and have an engineering approach to to finding out, determining whether or not the airplane was suitable for use in the fleet. That was a whole fundamental reason for the course. So not as opposed to Top Gun. Top Gun is okay. Now I've got an airplane. The test pilot school people at the test center say it's supposed to fly the mission. So since it's going to fly the mission, how do we use it? What sort of tactics are we going to use? And how do we use it against a particular target, weapon system, or another airplane? That's entirely different scope of effort.
Very interesting.
Both are very, very important, of course.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I had never heard of Naval Test Pilot School, and so that's really a unique, to be thrown at this problem set and get to be involved in making those choices. It just sounds really thrilling and like you said, challenging, yes, but like that's very incredibly important. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
it was during that period, right, that you were selected to transition into the F-14, or did that come later?
Came later. Came
Okay.
later. When I detached from test pilot school, I had orders to be F-14 on Kennedy, and the Vietnam War had not concluded it quite finished as yet. So I was ordered to squadron. The squadron was based here at Oceana, John F. Kennedy, and we began our workups to go to Vietnam, like I had done on this Forrestal airline. We started doing those kinds of things, preparation, tactics, kinds of training, tactical things, air-to-air, air-to-ground tactics, and so forth. So, excuse me. So in VF-14, and then the Vietnam War wound down, 75 thereabouts, and then we made 2 deployments on the Kennedy, and then we came back in that deployment and determined that we would be one of the first 2 East Coast squadrons to transition to the Tomcat. So we set our sights on Miramar, and some people detached and officer and lifted, but fundamentally PCS, or permanent change of station, the entire squadron, 2 squadrons, VF-32, our sister squadron as well, PCS out to California, to San Diego, where the F-14 training squadron was located, the only one at the time, and started the transition from the F-4 Phantom to the F-14 Tomcat in San Diego.
And I'm going to assume that you didn't just take an open book 10-question test the first time that you flew an F-14, right?
No, it did not. There's a very long ground school associated with that. Not too long, but there are things that you had to do, and some simulator time as well. It was not like being at Pax River, although we could have done that. But, we were going to use the airplane entirely differently than we had used in Pax River. So anyway, into the syllabus, and the people who are out there in the training squadron is VF-124, Fighter Squadron 124, and really a bunch of really first-class people on the cadre of the F-14 training. Really fantastic people, great aviators, and great instructors as well. We went through that syllabus in San Diego. We were out there for about 6 months, and did a turnabout while we were there, headed back east, and brought the Tomcat east to Oceana.
What were the key differences between, because I didn't know anything about this until my dad one day told me a story that he'd never told me before. That is how this podcast got its name, is from the story I wrote about the story he told me about a Rio that he had been in the RAG with. And, there was something that happened on takeoff. They lost an engine on takeoff. The pilot had flown the F-4 and did exactly what was the right thing to do in the F-4 for that scenario. But with the F-14, it's enough of a different jet that immediately it became an unsurvivable event. And so when you were training, did you know already what new limits you might have in the Tomcat, or was that part of the training process to kind of figure out, okay, what can we do with this jet that we couldn't do with that jet? And what kinds of things did you learn during that 6 months?
Wasn't any train that used sort of comparative analysis of one against the other. There wasn't nothing like that, of course, except for this. This is a new beast, a new animal, new airplane, new engines, new weapon system, entirely. And the F-14 was bigger than the F-4. We designed the F-14 to give it a better on-station capability. So that meant more fuel than the F-4 can have, more fuel internally. When you have more fuel, you have to, things just get bigger. And so the F-14 became the big fighter, people called it. But we didn't have an awareness at that time of this particular flight characteristics that we talked about, the one that went off the cat, the burner blowout off the cat, and then the yaw that developed, and it put them in extremis. No one really thought about that, to tell you the truth. And the training syllabi, air-to-air training syllabi, was pretty much similar to what we experienced in the training syllabi for the F-4 Phantom. However, their updated systems, weapon systems updated, and the flight control systems were different, of course. So there was a lot more of an in-depth look at the airplane than we would have had at Paxuba, for example, in terms of systems, systems working and operating, limitations.
What was it like flying across country with those F-14s and being the first people at Oceana, flying the big fighter? How did you guys feel about that new label?
Oh, very cool. It was very cool because it was this was back in 1970. I think when would have been 1974, 75 million bucks. Being the first, because the Tomcat was all the rage at the time. It was iconic, in terms of its look and its capability and so forth. It had some limitations, however, and set it apart from the Phantom. We can talk about those later on, but in terms of bringing the airplane back here to the East Coast and making it part of the Atlantic Fleet, we were really proud of being able to do that and to be part of the whole program. It really made us feel really, really good. Good in terms of our ability to deal with this airplane, this new animal we have now, and make sure it's introduced to the fleet properly.
Yeah, was it your job then to train other people on the F-14 when you got to Oceana? Or did they then go to San Diego and get trained up and come back?
We trained the first two squadrons at Miramar, and then the follow-on squadrons were all trained at Oceana. Transition from the F-4 to the Tomcat at Oceana. And we made the first deployment, East Coast deployment on the Kennedy with the VF-14 and VF-32. And I detached immediately after our in-shop to the Mediterranean on the Kennedy. And I went back to the East Coast, back to Oceana, where along with another group of guys, stood up the F-14 training squadron here at Oceana, VF-1, and started that whole transition for us to turn it into, to establish this training squadron, to transition follow-on squadrons into the Tomcat. The next two to transition into the Tomcat were VF-41 and VF-84, and the team that I had assembled, pilots and radios and maintenance personnel as well, got into business of training these new guys about into the F-14 and then transition. So that's how the RAG began here in Oceana.
That's amazing because I've seen the rag, for the Hornet, when I was, I don't know, in late teens. I think it's incredible to be involved in that effort, and let's talk a little bit about those limitations. You mentioned that there were limitations with the Tomcat. What were some of those limitations?
Well, the limitations are, I'm talking in terms of system limitations, oil pressure, hydraulic pressure, airspeed limitations that you might have to observe. Similar to other airplanes have their own personality, their own limitations. You have to know those as a pilot, and you want to exceed those limits. There wasn't anything really. One thing that we did know about the Tomcat that started rear its ugly head was that we had an engine called the TF-30, the turbofan engine. And we were only supposed to have fielded 20 or 24 airplanes, F-14, in the fleet with the TF-30. All subsequent airplanes were supposed to have had the Dash 110, G-Dash 110 engine, which is a much more powerful engine, a much more reliable engine than the TF-30 was. TF-30 had some unique problems of its own. We had incidents where accidents occurred where the compressor blades would fail and then shrapnel up through the cockpit area, loss of airplane. We had a lot of compressor stalls. When compressor stall with the TF-30, and they can get you in, cause a departure to occur, departure from controlled flight occur, and get you into a flat spin. And a flat spin in the Tomcat was almost pretty much unrecoverable. Couldn't get out of it. So you had to, when you're flying airplane, you had to be aware of that and not avoid those flight regimes that might get you, might push you over the edge. So they couldn't be careful. And those kinds of limitations were well known by everybody who flew the airplane to make sure they don't take it up to the edge, but don't take it over the edge. One guy who could take it over the edge and survive was Snort. He could always trim the blades to fly the airplane a little bit differently than he did the others. He was a great pilot.
I think that would be a great, because we're recording this in pieces just because you have so many stories to share. I'd love to end today's session with Snort and your recollections of him in those days, the early days of Snort flying the F-14. Because I grew up hearing about how epic of a pilot Snort was too. So when did you meet him along your journey?
Yeah, I had screened for command of the F-14 squadron. It was going to be, funnily enough, VF-142, which I was supposed to have gone to when I was a nugget, years before that. And so now I'm going to be the XO for a year and a half, and the fleet up become the commanding officer. So I checked into VF-142. That squadron was assigned to America, and in that squadron, the LSO was Dale Snodgrass. And so I met Dale Snodgrass. I also met a couple other people whose names are familiar to some folks. At the time, Lieutenant Commander Jay Johnson, who later became senior, and Alex Rucker, probably another really great fighter pilot, Rattler. And Lieutenant Commander Dave Walker, who was an astronaut, became an astronaut in his career. Full of really wonderful people in the VF-142. I was lucky to have that kind of talent, in my unit. So, that's when I first met Snort. He was the squadron LSO, and then the landing signal officer, and I could tell right away, just watching him fly, and the way he carried himself, he had some talent, and we should respect that. So we had a little bit of competition going on in the ship as far as landing grade was concerned, hook score is concerned. Hook score for the uninitiated. Every landing that you make on the aircraft carrier is graded by the landing signal officer. And there's something in the each squadron readiness called the greenie board, and it shows with color coded what kind of landing you made, whether it was okay, fair, or not so good. And it's posted for where everybody can see. And so, as a consequence, it becomes very, very competitive in terms of who's the best pilot around the ship. That's how you measure the real talent of any aviators, how he does on and off an aircraft carrier. Some are great tacticians, not so good around the ship. Some are good around the ship and not such great tacticians. But Snort was all the above. He was a great tactician and great around the ship. So he was a lieutenant, I think, and we had a competition going for dinner, provided dinner. Whomever did the best for a particular line period, a period of time, in hook score. And I set the limits in terms of what we were going to do. So we were neck and neck landing score for our first couple of months of our deployment, and then we terminated the contest. But I'm going to say it was a tie.
I'm I wish I could see the boards to verify this, but yeah, yeah, I mean, in terms of the number of platforms that both of you flew well, it's I'm not surprised. I Snort is beloved.
Yes, yes,
Yeah, and I think we can talk later about some of the other stories from Snort because they're tied up with like deployments that
yes,
you were on, and I would love to hear about those as they occurred. But I'm glad that his name has come up now.
yeah.
Maybe as a last question before we pause this segment, can we talk about when you got your call sign and maybe like a sanitized version of what that was?
Well, I had a call sign that somebody had given me years before when the Bad Fred name came around, and uh, that wasn't a very good call sign. So and the call signs weren't all the rage in my early career as they are now, and as they became and as they are now. So the I'll just say the period of time that occurred was really when I was lieutenant commander in Fire Squadron 14. That's when actually the moniker was slapped up on top of my head. That's how I became Bad Fred, rather how the name was initiated, where and when on America, no correction, on John F. Kennedy in the mid 70s.
Very cool. It's a great call sign. There are some that are not as cool as that one
Yeah.
sounds. Everybody wants to be bad Fred. Like, oh, I wouldn't mess with you. Um, I guess maybe briefly we could talk about the O Club. What role,
Um,
because you mentioned this, the change in, I think about all the squadrons now have like their legends and they have their things that they say when they come to the O Club, and everybody's differentiated themselves and everybody has their call signs. It's like part of this, the important culture of being a fighter pilot. How important was the O Club in that whole, being a fighter pilot atmosphere, culture?
well, what the culture developed over time in terms of utilizing the officers club as a place where you could uh, see your friends, you could talk about the day's activities or the week's activities, and talk about swapping sea stories and telling lies to one another. So it became sort of a center point of everybody's life at the end of each working week. Friday night happy hour was quite a big thing. In some places, like for example, at Miramar, happy hour on Wednesday night was also very large in everybody's lives out there on the West Coast, and not so much here in the East Coast. But Friday night was very big, and it was very important for purposes of camaraderie, morale, esprit, and you can see the same sort of thing in historical productions of flying bombing World War II squadrons. The amount of time they spent devoted to being with one another at the pub or in the no club. That matter. So it became very important to us. And there wasn't the stigma that it's signed to it today in terms of consumption of alcohol. So that changed things big time. So it was a lot of fun, and people look forward to it. And it really was important in terms of who you were and what you were as a fighter pilot.
Yeah, you mentioned, what it was like for World War II pilots, like your father-in-law. I
Yes.
mean, can you talk about what role that played for him? Because you were telling me when we were preparing for this, just the amount of loss that they faced in World War II, and what how important it was to come together after flying. So can you talk briefly about what you
They
know of that?
they were they were very fatalistic. They were not so much. We felt we were bulletproof, and my career as a junior officer. Not, we really thought that our abilities were unique and that we could get out of any bad situation in any time. However, in my father-in-law's case, different story. Their losses were so high, they were very fatalistic about their future. It wasn't as if they were going to be, they both were, but they knew that the odds were stacked against them so significantly that they just felt it was sort of inevitable something. But as my grandfather, my father-in-law used to say, he would get one of my friends got the chop, and they said he got the chop and he was killed in combat or crashed in operations or something. So, to them, I think it was a place for them to let off steam more so, and to try to use alcohol consumption to bury their emotions and their feeling of impending doom, if you will, because the chances were slim that if they were an operational pilot in the bomber squadrons and the world, my father-in-law was in, they knew the loss rates were so high that they were very likely not to, they wouldn't be able to survive it. Very fatalistic attitude, and their humor was also very black, dark humor. My father-in-law used to say a toast to me. He used the toast that they used in World War II in the pub or in the officers' mess. And the toast went something like this: "Here's to us who is like us. Damn few, most of them are dead." And they drink the beer. That was their toast. So very fatalistic, very dark, because they knew that their chances of survival were very low. He, however, beat the odds in an incredible way. Beat the odds in the fact that a normal tour of combat duty in the Royal Air Force at that time was 25 missions. They flew 25 missions and they'd be pulled off the line and be sent to training to be instructed or whatever. And then in the case of him, he was Australian, so he'd be sent home back to Australia for 25 missions. He later bumped it up to 30 missions, but he flew 3 tours back to back to back. So he flew like 70 combat missions without a break or with minimal break. So the odds of doing that are infinitesimal. He did the math. They lose loss rate to 20 to 25% sometimes, some of the missions that they flew. So yeah, so quite different, a different outlook on life, different purpose for them to gather in places like the pub with the officers' mess, or the enlisted mess too. They had beer in the enlisted mess. Then our outlook on life and what we use the happy hour, the officers' code for, different, entirely different culture set, really based on the circumstances that we faced, and that he faced.
Absolutely. And I definitely think we can talk more about that next time, about, because you've said too, you do remember the people who you've lost and you tell the stories, but you're telling those stories too to remember, it's part of, from what I gather, okay, this is what happened and I need to keep this in mind because we can't let that happen again. But also recollecting the people who did, meet their fate in the Tomcat, in the Phantom,
Yeah.
recalling them, but also, yeah, just always trying to be better prepared for what comes next. That's how I would say. Would you agree with that?
I agree with that. Yes.
Yeah. But it's a hallowed environment. My dad's Fridays at the club were sacrosanct. You didn't
Yes,
get in the
absolutely.
way of that, even after he flew. My dad didn't fly at all when I was a kid, but he went to the O Club every Friday night to be with
Be in that
his
environment.
his fellow fighter pilots. And
Absolutely.
they were my uncles. One of them actually is my uncle, one of them actually is his brother, but
Really?
Yeah, Mark Wheelis is my dad's brother, Wheels. His call sign is also Wheels. Because with a name like that, how could you not be
You not
Wheels?
need wheels. You gotta
Right.
be wheels.
But yeah, I mean, I had so many uncles who had no relation to me whatsoever, and they were just really special to my dad
Yeah.
because they share a passion.